Okay, so I'm going to get started here. All right, so we're going to start today by talking about Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. And this letter is his defense of some civil disobedience that he and other members of his organization engaged in the city of Birmingham, for which they were arrested and put into jail. MLK throughout this letter is going to call civil disobedience direct action. This bit of terminology is not really that important one way or the other. We'll generally refer to what MLK is talking about as civil disobedience. So, in this letter, MLK makes lots of different claims and arguments in favor of what he had done, and also generally his strategy of using nonviolent resistance to unjust laws. And so I'm going to go through it. A lot of this is going to be, because just the format of how the letter is set up, a lot of this is opening questions more than it is analyzing arguments. So I'm going to just go through it, talk about some questions that you might want to think about while you're reading through this, while you're reviewing it for the exam that we'll be having at the end of this module. And just a reminder, this is the last set of readings for this module, so tomorrow I will have a review session where mostly I'm going to be guided by your questions. I'll go through things a little bit, but tomorrow really, if there's any day for you to watch live, that's going to be the day, because that's the day that I will be mostly focused on answering questions. But anyway, getting into the MLK. So he says that nonviolent direct action causes tension. He admits that. But he thinks that the kind of tension it causes is of a constructive sort. And he opposes this to the kind of tension that results from violent action, right, from violent resistance. So think about why you might think that nonviolent direct action is more constructive. Why would it be more likely to bring other parties to the negotiation table? Why is it likely that nonviolent resistance will bring the city leaders, the city government, to the negotiation table with MLK and his group than if they had a violent riot or if they did some sort of violent resistance to law? Something you can think about. A thing that he says not long after that, in defense of engaging in direct action at all and not just waiting around for more rounds of negotiation. He says, and this is a quote, "History is the long and tragic story of the fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily." Does that seem right? Do you think that it's true that history generally bears out the idea that privileged groups rarely will give up their privileges voluntarily? And if so, what do you think that means for how we should think about change and progress? How should we think about the ways that we have to go about changing society for the better, eliminating privilege, making a more equal playing field for everyone? So again, these are just things for you to consider and get you thinking about these issues in a philosophical way. So MLK, in his letter, argues that there are two types of laws. There are just laws and unjust laws. And just laws, he says, ought to be followed, while an unjust law can and maybe even should be broken. And certainly, we should get rid of unjust laws on MLK's view. And he gives a number of different tests for whether a law is just or unjust. The, of course, core distinction is that a just law is one, according to MLK, that conforms with the moral law, and an unjust law is one which does not conform with the moral law, which either goes beyond it or falls short of it. But he gives a number of more practical tests that we can provide for deciding whether a law is just or unjust. And most of these, you'll notice, he's telling you just how to identify an unjust law, but he's not necessarily saying that a law which doesn't have those features will be a just law. So these are just what philosophers would call a sufficient condition for being an unjust law, but not a necessary condition. So a sufficient condition is one where if I see that a thing has the trait, fulfills that condition, then I know that it's part of this other group that I'm trying to identify. But that doesn't necessarily mean that anything that doesn't have that will fail to be part of that group. So to use this example of laws, he says, for instance, that an unjust law is a code inflicted upon a minority which that minority had no part in enacting or creating because they did not have the unhampered right to vote. So he's not saying here that any law where the minority did have an unhampered right to vote would necessarily be just. We might think that there are lots of cases where you could have an unjust law that still allowed the minority to vote. So you could imagine a law of the following kind. Suppose that everyone was allowed to vote on whether... Suppose that in the South, before the Civil Rights era, everyone was allowed to vote in favor or against segregation. And not only that, but they allowed all people, including African Americans, to vote freely. They didn't hamper their votes at all. And it turned out that most of the people at that time preferred segregation, that they voted for segregation. Well, under those circumstances, I don't think MLK would say segregation would become a just law. Rather, he would, it wouldn't have failed this particular test for being an unjust law, but it would have failed some other tests that we could give. But going back to this test, where MLK says, an unjust law is a code inflicted upon a minority which that minority had no part in enacting or creating because they did not have the unhampered right to vote. So think about that. Do you think that it's always the case that a law which has those features, which is inflicted upon a minority, which that minority had no part in enacting or creating because they didn't have the unhampered right to vote, is that true in all cases? Think of some other groups that haven't had unhampered rights to vote in the past and currently don't today even. What about felons who often don't have the right to vote? They're a minority. Laws imposed upon them, are they necessarily unjust? What about non-citizen residents who don't have the right to vote? So people who are living here but aren't citizens. They don't have the right to vote. So are all laws imposed on them unjust laws? What about children? Children don't have the right to vote. This is a principle which makes sense on its face, but we might want to think, what are the limitations of this principle? Is it the case that always when a code is inflicted upon a minority which that minority had no part in enacting or creating because they didn't have the unhampered right to vote, is that always the makings of an unjust law, or just in certain cases? Does it matter who's being excluded, right? So this is kind of getting you an idea of how you should think about these sort of questions. Don't just take the surface level meaning. Clearly here MLK is talking about racial discrimination in the ability to vote and how that can affect the justice of a law. But what about other sorts of discrimination? Does this principle generalize to all other cases? What about a law that is consistent with the moral law, which is the ultimate test of a just law or an unjust law according to MLK? For example, a law against murder. Suppose that was enacted by a dictator. Suppose no one had the right to vote at all. Is that law now unjust as a result of people not having the right to vote? It's difficult to say. You could say yes. You might think that only democratically chosen laws can ultimately be just, and any other law is some sort of unjust. But it's something to think about. Would a law against murder enacted by a dictator be an unjust law? Certainly, according to this principle, it sounds like it would, but you might want to, query that. So, MLK goes on to say that civil disobedience or disobeying laws must be done with three conditions, and he says that if you don't meet these conditions, then you're not really engaging in the sort of civil disobedience or the sort of disobeying of laws that he thinks is legitimate. Right? He's contrasting himself here with those segregationists who are breaking the law by keeping schools segregated and violating other sorts of Supreme Court rulings and so on. And he says that civil disobedience to be legitimate has to be done openly, it has to be done lovingly, and it has to be done with a willingness to accept the penalty. So think about, why would these conditions be the ones that are required for legitimate law breaking? Right? Why would MLK put these as the defining conditions? Why in particular should someone breaking an unjust law accept the penalty? If it's an unjust law, why should I be penalized for breaking it? I haven't done anything immoral, right? Think back to Socrates here. He, in the Credo, accepts that the punishment he was given was unjust, but he thinks that he should accept the penalty anyway. Now, he has different sorts of reasons, perhaps, than MLK. But MLK does mention Socrates several times throughout this letter. And so think about the parallels here. Think about to what extent MLK and Socrates might agree or disagree, and where this sort of where they might think, why they might think that you have to have a willingness to accept the penalty even when the law is unjust. Also here consider, though, an example that MLK himself brought up, people hiding Jews from the Nazis in the era where the Nazis controlled much of Europe. Now that was illegal for them to do. The Nazis set up laws that required you to turn in any Jews to the proper authorities. But consider the people who hid, for instance, Anne Frank, or any other of the many people who heroically hid Jews from the Nazis. They were breaking the law, but they obviously weren't doing so openly, nor did they want to accept the punishment for it, which was often quite severe, till death in some cases. Was that sort of law-breaking illegitimate? Should we think that they were doing something wrong by violating the law, but violating in a way which wasn't open, which wasn't with a willingness to penalty? Or is it the case that in some cases you are permitted to break the law discreetly and with no willingness to accept the penalty, with a hope to avoid the penalty? So those are just some things to think about as you're reading through, again, MLK's letter from Birmingham jail, and reflecting on the arguments within it. So I see that we have one person watching now, so if I can stop for a minute and take questions about MLK first before going on to Locke. Locke will have a lot of things to say relevant to what we were just talking about, but I'll give it a minute here. Okay, I'm going to go on. Doesn't seem to be any questions. Okay, so going on to Locke. So Locke is writing much earlier than the 20th century. He's way back in the 17th century. And he's writing in a time when monarchies were the most common government of his day. So that's something to keep in mind as you're reading Locke and considering his arguments, but he's generally a fan of representative government. So Locke was a big influence on the founders of the American Republic, and he has got some ideas about natural rights being rights that aren't granted by the state, but rather are something that everyone has as a virtue of being human. And this gives some ideas, some different ideas perhaps about what our duty to obey the law is and when we are permitted to resist it. Right? So if you look in section 204, Locke seems to be saying that we're permitted to resist any unjust force that the state is imposing upon us. Agents of the law, in modern times, police officers, judges, and so on, are not immune, according to Locke, to rightful resistance when they act unjustly, even if they've been authorized to do so by the government. That's in section 206. However, this right of... So, you would be permitted to, it sounds like, according to Locke, to treat them just as you would treat any other sort of criminal. If they're violating your natural rights, if they're violating the natural law, so not the law that's on the books that the state has promulgated, but rather you could think of this like the moral law. If they're violating that in a way that oversteps your boundaries, you have a right to resist them just as you would any common criminal. Now, this right of resistance, according to Locke, is limited by circumstances which are more relevant in the case of agents of the law, he thinks, than in the case of many common criminals. In particular, Locke says if you have a way of being compensated for the injustice done to you, you have to take that route before you consider violent force. He does think that in some cases you can violently resist both criminals and agents of the law who are doing things which violate your natural rights. But he says that in most cases, agents of the law can be brought into court. You're not in a situation where you're being held at gunpoint by someone who wishes to kill you, right? Under those circumstances, of course, it'd be acceptable to use violent and even deadly force, Locke would say, to defend yourself. But in the face of people like his example of the banker who steals some of your deposit, you should bring them to court first. You shouldn't just go straight to violence. For the sake of stability and lack of discord in society. Now, some cases of agents of the state, you will be in a situation where it's just like the person who is looking to kill you and has a gun pointed at you. In those cases, you are, just as with the common criminal, permitted to act immediately with violent force, according to Locke. So, moving on to section 222, Locke gives some more explanation of this right to resist unjust governments and even overthrow them. He says that whenever the government would take away or destroy the property of people generally in society, or would exercise some sort of arbitrary power that's apart from the natural law, the people have a right to rebel against them. Now, property for Locke, I should say, goes beyond just things like your house or your car or your clothes. It also means your body, right? Locke has this idea of self-ownership, that your body is a kind of property that you have. Locke considers a couple objections to this sort of right to resist arbitrary and overreaching government. And he points out that those who say that a right of revolution undermines social order are resting this on the same sort of principle that would also exclude us resisting criminals, pirates, and so on. And the idea here is that people will argue, you don't have a right of revolution because if we have that right, then we're going to end up with lots of social disorder and bloodshed. And he says, look, even resisting common criminals and pirates and people of that sort can cause social disorder and bloodshed. So that on its own is not enough of a reason to deny people the right of revolution. Of course, we should be aware of those possible consequences when we're thinking about engaging in revolution, which is a very serious act. But it's not something that on its own can rule out people having the right to do that. Because in Locke's terminology, a government that engages in these sort of overreaches, in these violations of your natural rights, is engaged in a state of war with you. So at that point, when you're already in a state of war, social order has, in a sense, already broken down. And if there isn't bloodshed now, there's likely to be some sort of bloodshed in the enforcement of these arbitrary and unjust laws. And he says, without any resistance to criminality and oppression, the world is ripe for conquest by criminals and oppressors. Right? If we never resist criminals and oppressors, then there's a huge incentive for people to be criminals and be oppressors, because they know that no one is ever going to stand up to them. Right? They know that they can, without penalty, go around stealing things that aren't theirs, taking what they like, exercising arbitrary power over people. And Locke criticizes those who think that the resistance can be done completely non-violently, right? As he might, if he was contemporary with him, he might have criticized MLK for this. He says, and this is a quote, "He that shall oppose an assault only with a shield to receive the blows, or in any more respectful posture, without a sword in his hand to abate the confidence and force of the assailant, will quickly be at an end of his resistance, and will find such a defense serve only to draw on himself the worse usage. He, therefore, who may resist, must be allowed to strike." So he's saying here, if you really take seriously the idea that you have the right to resist unjust laws and unjust actions of the government, then you have to accept that you're allowed to do so violently in some cases. Because if you're never allowed to do so violently, then there's no check on what the violent, powerful forces of the government can do to you. And in fact, he says you're only going to draw on yourself more penalties, more violations of your rights, if you never hold a sword, if you never are willing to violently defend yourself. Is that right? Right? Think about how MLK might respond to that. He might point out that maybe it's much less constructive to engage in violent resistance than nonviolent resistance, right? And there's lots of these parallels throughout the readings, and these are the sort of things you should be thinking about, especially going into the exam, which is going to be talking about some of these parallels. How would these different thinkers who are spread across thousands of years, but all talking about the same sort of issues, how would they interact with each other? How would they respond to each other? Okay, so that ends the, lecture section of this. We have a couple people watching, so I'll stop for questions at the end here and see if anyone has anything they want me to talk some more about, something I might not have covered. Okay. Alright then, thanks, and I will go to the review tomorrow. Just another reminder, please, if there's any day you're going to show up to watch, tomorrow is the day to do it. I'll be taking questions live at that time, and that's going to take up the bulk of the review. You can also post questions on D2L or email them to me, and I'd be happy to answer them in the review tomorrow as well. So thanks, and I will see you tomorrow.